Good afternoon and welcome to St Peter Mancroft Church, whether you're here in person or watching online now or later. If you are here in the church, please continue your visit as you wish. Don't let us interrupt you. I'm Catherine Waddams, a lay minister here, and today, as part of our weekly reflections, I want to talk about living lightly. Living lightly is the strapline for our weekly tips on reducing our impact on the planet, which we're introducing into this newsletter. Excuse me, I just realised I haven't changed the view, so I will just change the view so people online could see me. So as I say, we're starting some weekly tips called Living Lightly in our newsletter. Do look out for them. The phrase living lightly is inspired by Francis of Assisi. His Christian perspective, like that of many other faiths, is through the lens of the church and all its creatures, the lens of the earth and all its creatures as God's creation. Living 800 years ago in Italy, before the current crisis resulting from human damage, Francis had a particularly keen appreciation of creation, which is embedded in the Franciscan way of life. You may know the work of Richard Rohr, an American Franciscan priest who founded the Center for Action and Contemplation. If not, you might be interested in his daily reflections. You can look them up online or ask me where to find them. And as a Franciscan, he has some very relevant thoughts about seeing the world through the eyes of its creator, God. Rohr reminds us that Francis was acutely aware of sharing this earth, our lives, our work, our leisure, with all of God's creatures, who he viewed as our brothers and sisters. His own pattern of life was very different from the established monastic life of the time, with its model of withdrawal from the world and effort to domesticate nature and bring it under control. Rather, Francis modeled living lightly, being a burden neither to the earth nor to those who fed and clothed him. That's why Francis was not a monk of the regular sort. His friars were a totally new religious movement. He wanted us to live in the middle of the cities, right with the people, rather than separate ourselves. A bit like this church, which is so aware of being in the heart of the city with the city in its heart. Francis didn't hate the world and want to withdraw from it. Instead, he looked for a way from within ourselves that we could love and have compassion for the world. Of course, that sometimes may mean going apart for a time in order to pray and contemplate, to become more aware of God's presence and guidance, as of course Jesus himself did. Indeed, Jesus himself never told us to separate ourselves from the world. Instead, the Gospels are full of stories about how closely he engaged with the everyday world in all its messiness. Another Franciscan theme and sign of God's love is simplicity. We should multiply words, explanations, actions, only when necessary, Francis tells us. You've perhaps heard the axiom that summarizes part of the Franciscan rule: preach the gospel at all times, and when absolutely necessary, use words. Francis was all about orthopraxy, or living the gospel, rather than orthodoxy, the verbal beliefs that go with it. Which fits right in with our practical tips for living lightly, which are part of our introduction to Creation Tide, when we will focus on celebrating God's creation during September and leading up to our Harvest Festival on the 1st of October, when the bishop will lead our service, preach, and celebrate the new efficient and effective internal lighting, the solar panels on the roof, the batteries down below, the heat pumps behind the octagon on Weaver's Lane. These improvements all help us to reduce the impact that we make on the earth as a community. It seems somehow appropriate that such investments for the future are funded by a combination of generous legacies from previous congregation members and from funds which help us to demonstrate benefits for the future for other churches too. If you want to know more about the Church Eco Project, there are details, I think, at the back of church, and certainly a short video on the church website and on the website of the Church of England. It captures the vision, the enthusiasm, the really hard work of all those involved, and sets a fine example for us to follow as individuals too. So how can we follow this example as individual members of this community, lessen our own harmful effects? We'll be sharing ideas each week through the newsletter. Please read them and act on them if appropriate. And even more importantly, do send us your own ideas and tips to share anonymously. Details are in the newsletter. That will help us work towards our gold A Rocha Eco Award. We have already achieved bronze and silver, and I think you can see those on the board here, and there's a gap in the middle waiting for the gold, perhaps particularly appropriate in this week of Olympic Games. The contributions we can each make are important, both at the individual and global level. We have seen how living lightly directly reflects our faith, and in reflecting on how we live with creation, we allow ourselves and our own relationship with the Creator to change. And these little changes can make a difference. I relate very much to the saying, if you think you are too small to make a difference, you've never been to bed with a mosquito. More positively and importantly, perhaps, a lot of us contributing imperfectly to help the environment will be much more effective than a few people doing it perfectly. So, just a preview, our first tip this week will be a classic one: turn the tap off when you brush your teeth. Your water is probably metered, so this will save a few pennies too. Here in the drier eastern region, Anglian Water now meters over 90% of its customers, the highest proportion in the country. But more importantly, you can save up to 12 litres of water each time. I had to look it up, but that's 2.5 gallons in old money, 150 gallons a month. And although it may sometimes seem that we do have plenty of water, especially this summer, saving it means that the resources used to clean it and get it safely to our taps are saved. A small saving for each of us, but it would soon add up if we all participated. And water stress is already increasing here and across the world, and is becoming a major driver of political tension and emigration. Becoming more aware of ways in which we can live lightly may also encourage us to speak about the issues and be aware of how we might influence others we meet or who have influence at local or national level to take the threat to our climate seriously. We know what the problems are, and we know what the solutions are, but they will be expensive, at least to start with. Who should pay? There's a real danger that those who know they will lose from the necessary changes or have to pay for them will use their economic and political power to oppose it. The effects of climate damage are already falling disproportionately on those who can least afford them, both here at home, where investment in insulation and other climate mitigation measures are unaffordable for many, and worldwide, where we see the stresses falling most heavily on low-income countries and the poorest people within them. Our faith's bias to the poor demands that we look out and speak out for the most vulnerable of our sisters and brothers in a situation where our own comfort may be threatened? How can we contribute to climate justice, to tackling climate change so that the costs of prevention and mitigation are carried by those who can best afford it? It's a really important question for prayer, for action, for our speaking out. A meeting of the Norwich Interfaith Group last night heard the words of Dr. Gus Seth, an American environmental lawyer and advocate, who said, "I used to think that the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that with 30 years of good science, we could address those problems. But I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with those, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation." And he says, "We scientists don't know how to do that." As people of faith, we believe that there is a route to such transformation and that we can play our own part through prayer, through community, through our own actions, through a common voice. Perhaps we can start with the invitation and response to live lightly each week.